The story of Palestine begins long before borders or empires, in a land where humanity first learned to build, trade, and believe. Nestled between Africa and Asia, this narrow strip of earth became a bridge between continents, a place where cultures met and civilizations collided. Archaeological evidence shows that humans have lived in the region for hundreds of thousands of years. Stone tools found in the Jordan Valley and at sites such as Ayyubids reveal traces of early human migration. By the Neolithic period, around 800 BC, farming villages dotted the fertile plains, and early communities cultivated wheat and barley, domesticating animals and establishing permanent settlements. As centuries passed, these small agricultural villages evolved into city-states. During the Bronze Age, roughly between 3300 and 1200 BC, Canaanite civilization thrived. Canaanites built fortified cities such as Jericho, Megiddo, and Lachish, trading goods like olive oil, copper, and pottery with Egypt and Mesopotamia. The land's position along the ancient trade routes known as the Via Maris and the King's Highway made it a coveted prize for neighboring powers. Egyptian records from the 2nd millennium BC refer to the region as Retinue or Canaan. And pharaohs like Thutmose III conducted military campaigns to assert control over it. Around 1200 BC, the Late Bronze Age collapsed across the eastern Mediterranean, and new peoples arrived along the coast. Among them were the Philistines, possibly descendants of the sea peoples mentioned in Egyptian inscriptions. They settled in cities like Ashdod, Ashkelon, and Gaza, forming a pentapolis that would play a central role in the coming centuries. Inland, small highland communities began to appear, groups that would later be known collectively as the Israelites. Archaeological evidence suggests they emerged from local Canaanite populations, adopting distinctive cultural and religious practices. By the 10th century BC, the Hebrew Bible describes a united monarchy under Saul, David, and Solomon. Jerusalem became a royal capital, and the first temple was built as a center of worship. After Solomon's death, the United Kingdom split into two, Israel in the north and Judah in the south. These kingdoms endured cycles of prosperity and destruction, caught between the ambitions of the Assyrian, Babylonian, and Egyptian empires. In 722 BC, the Assyrians conquered the northern kingdom of Israel, exiling much of its population. A century later, the Babylonians captured Jerusalem, destroyed the temple in 586 BC, and deported much of the Judean elite to Babylon. Yet the memory of the land remained central to their identity. When Cyrus the Great of Persia conquered Babylon in 539 BC, he allowed the exiles to return, and the Second Temple was constructed. The Persian period saw a revived Judean community under imperial rule, with local governors and religious reforms shaping a new sense of identity tied to the land and faith. By the 4th century BC, the armies of Alexander the Great swept through the Near East, bringing Hellenistic culture to Palestine. Greek influence reached every aspect of life: language, art, administration, though local traditions persisted. After Alexander's death, his empire fractured. Palestine became a frontier between the Ptolemies of Egypt and the Seleucids of Syria, a stage for constant wars. The Maccabean revolt of 167 BC emerged from resistance to forced Hellenization and led to the brief Hasmonean kingdom, a rare period of Jewish self-rule. But internal divisions and external pressures soon invited Rome's intervention. In 63 BC, Pompey the Great entered Jerusalem, bringing the land under Roman dominion. Under Roman rule, the region was reorganized as part of the province of Judea. Herod the Great, appointed by Rome, reigned from 37 BC to 4 BC, launching ambitious building projects, fortresses like Masada, cities such as Caesarea Maritima, and the grand renovation of the Temple in Jerusalem. It was in this Roman-controlled Palestine that Christianity was born. Jesus of Nazareth preached in Galilee and Judea, and his crucifixion under Roman authority would echo across world history. The early Christian community took root in Jerusalem before spreading throughout the empire. But Roman rule was harsh. Heavy taxation and religious tension led to several Jewish revolts. The first major uprising in 66 CE resulted in the destruction of the Second Temple in 70 CE. Another revolt, the Bar Kokhba Rebellion of 132 CE, ended disastrously. The Romans crushed the resistance, expelled many Jews, and rebuilt Jerusalem as a pagan city named Aelia Capitolina. The province was renamed Syria Palestina, reviving the old name Philistia in an attempt to erase Jewish ties to the land. Despite this, Jewish communities endured across Galilee and the diaspora. Christianity continued to grow, and by the 4th century CE, under Emperor Constantine, it became the dominant religion of the empire. Jerusalem emerged again as a sacred center, this time for Christians, with the construction of the Church of the Holy Sepulchre in 335 CE. By the 4th century CE, Palestine stood at the heart of the Christian world. Pilgrims traveled from distant lands to walk the streets of Jerusalem, Bethlehem, and Nazareth. Monasteries rose in the deserts of Judea, and churches lined the coasts and hills. The Byzantine Empire, successor to Rome, governed the region through provincial administrations, maintaining roads, cities, and taxation systems. Greek became the language of administration, and Christianity the soul of public life. The population was a tapestry of communities: Greeks, Arameans, Jews, Samaritans, and Arabs, each leaving its mark on the landscape. Yet peace was fragile. Religious differences and heavy taxation often bred unrest. The Samaritans rebelled several times during the 5th and 6th centuries, and earthquakes and plagues struck major cities. Still, life in Palestine remained vibrant. The city of Gaza became a center of philosophy and poetry. Caesarea, with its library and harbor, stood as a hub of scholarship, and Jerusalem drew pilgrims whose journeys would shape Christian imagination for centuries to come. In the early 7th century, a new power emerged from the Arabian Peninsula. The followers of Islam, led by Caliph Umar ibn al-Khattab, conquered Jerusalem in 637 CE. According to tradition, the city surrendered peacefully, and Umar entered it with respect for its holy sites. Under Muslim rule, known as the Rashidun Caliphate, Palestine became part of a larger world united by faith and language. Arabic replaced Greek in administration, and the land entered a new chapter of history. The Dome of the Rock was constructed in 692 CE on the Temple Mount, Haram al-Sharif, followed by the nearby Al-Aqsa Mosque. Together, they symbolize the spiritual significance of Jerusalem in Islam, believed to be the site of the Prophet Muhammad's night journey and ascension to heaven. For centuries, the region flourished under successive Islamic dynasties: Umayyad, Abbasid, and Fatimid. Cities like Ramla and Nablus grew as trade and cultural centers. Scholars, jurists, and poets traveled through Palestine's towns, linking them to Damascus, Baghdad, and Cairo. The coexistence of Muslims, Christians, and Jews, though sometimes uneasy, was generally sustained through systems of local autonomy and taxation that allowed communities to manage their own religious affairs. The land's identity was no longer bound solely to empire. It was now part of the broader Islamic world, with Jerusalem ranking among its holiest cities after Mecca and Medina. But the tide of empire never stopped shifting. In the 11th century, internal divisions and the rise of the Seljuk Turks unsettled the Middle East. Christian pilgrims faced new hardships reaching the Holy Land, and reports of mistreatment reverberated across Europe. In 1095, Pope Urban II called for a crusade to reclaim Jerusalem. The First Crusade marched across the Levant, seizing the city in 1099 after a brutal siege. The Crusaders established the Kingdom of Jerusalem and a network of fortresses across the land: Acre, Jaffa, Ascalon, and the castles of the Templars and Hospitallers that still scar the hillsides. For nearly 2 centuries, Palestine was the front line between Christendom and the Islamic world. The Crusaders fortified the coastal plains, built Gothic churches, and carved Latin rule into the landscape. Yet Muslim resistance never ceased. Under the leadership of figures like Enar ad-Din and al-ad-Din, Saladin, Muslim forces gradually reconquered the region. In 1187, after the decisive Battle of An, Saladin entered Jerusalem and restored Muslim control, allowing Christian worship but ending Crusader rule over the city. The Crusader presence lingered along the coast until 1291, when the last fortress at Acre fell to the Mamluks. The Mamluk Sultanate, a dynasty of warrior slaves who ruled from Cairo, governed Palestine for the next 2.5 centuries. They rebuilt towns, repaired roads, and restored mosques devastated by war. Jerusalem became a vibrant center of learning once again, home to scholars, artisans, and pilgrims. Under Mamluk rule, the region was divided into administrative districts, with Gaza, Jerusalem, and Nablus as key centers. Trade caravans linked Palestine to Damascus and Cairo, while the annual pilgrimage routes to Mecca passed through its deserts and oases. Yet despite the stability the Mamluks brought, the land bore the scars of centuries of conflict. Many villages lay in ruins, agriculture declined, and the population dwindled. Still, faith sustained the people. Muslims visited Jerusalem sanctuaries, Christians continued to venerate the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, and Jewish communities prayed at the remnants of their ancient temple. Palestine remained sacred to all 3 faiths, a place of memory, devotion, and yearning. Then, in 1516, another empire rose over the horizon. The Ottoman Turks, led by Sultan Selim I, defeated the Mamluks at Marj Dabik and incorporated Palestine into their vast realm. The Ottoman era would last for 4 centuries, reshaping the land once more while preserving its ancient rhythms. When the Ottoman Empire took control of Palestine in 1517, the region entered an age of relative continuity. Under the rule of Sultan Selim I and his successors, Palestine became part of the Ottoman province of Damascus, divided administratively into districts centered around Jerusalem, Gaza, and Nablus. The Ottomans did not treat Palestine as a distinct nation but as one province within their empire stretching from the Balkans to Arabia. Yet the centuries of Ottoman rule would profoundly shape the land's social fabric, cities, and identity. In the early years of Ottoman administration, Palestine was largely rural. Most of its people lived in small villages scattered among olive groves and fields of wheat and barley. Towns such as Hebron, Nablus, and Safed thrived as local markets and centers of learning. Jerusalem, although small compared to major imperial cities, was granted special status as a sacred trust. The Ottomans restored its walls under Sultan Suleiman the Magnificent in the 1530s, the same walls that still encircle the old city today. Suleiman also renovated the Haram al-Sharif, reaffirming Jerusalem's position as one of Islam's holiest sites. Pilgrims from across the Muslim world continued to flow into the city, while Christians and Jews also maintained their ancient places of worship. The empire's tolerance for religious diversity allowed Palestine's communities to coexist under the millet system, a form of communal autonomy for religious groups. Muslims, Christians, and Jews all managed their internal affairs under their own laws and clerical leadership, though Muslims held political primacy. Life in Ottoman Palestine was marked by a blend of local tradition and imperial order. Taxes were collected through local notables known as ayin, caravans traversed the land, and Arabic remained the language of daily life even as Turkish dominated official administration. During the 17th and 18th centuries, the empire's power waned. Local families, such as the Chukans in Nablus and the Ridwans in Gaza, gained influence. Some towns grew semi-independent, and lawlessness often spread in rural areas. Bedouin tribes roamed the desert fringes, sometimes clashing with settled communities. Despite these challenges, the population began to recover slowly, and by the 18th century, the cities of Jerusalem, Nablus, and Acre had become vibrant centers once more. Acre, in particular, rose to prominence under the rule of Ahmed Pasha al-Jazza, known as the Butcher, who governed in the late 18th century. A man of ruthless efficiency, al-Jazza restored order, expanded trade, and defended Acre against Napoleon Bonaparte's siege in 1799. His victory was a defining moment that preserved Ottoman control over Palestine at a time when European powers were extending their influence across the Middle East. By the 19th century, Ottoman Palestine stood at the crossroads of change. The empire launched sweeping reforms known as the Tanzimat, aiming to modernize governance and infrastructure. New schools, telegraphs, and roads were introduced, though much of rural Palestine remained poor and agrarian. Population growth accelerated, with towns like Jaffa and Haifa expanding due to maritime trade. European missionaries, scholars, and explorers began to visit in increasing numbers. The Holy Land fascinated the Christian West, not just as a site of faith but as a field of archaeology and imperial ambition. In 1831, Muhammad Ali of Egypt briefly conquered Palestine, sending his son Ibrahim Pasha to rule. His decade-long administration introduced reforms such as conscription, new taxes, and the opening of trade with Europe. But his rule provoked resistance, and by 1840, British and Ottoman forces forced the Egyptians to withdraw, restoring Ottoman authority. Still, the episode revealed how vulnerable the empire had become and how deeply European powers were now involved in its affairs. By the mid-1800s, Palestine was being pulled into global networks of religion, commerce, and politics. Protestant missions established schools and hospitals. Catholic and Orthodox communities expanded their presence, and European consulates opened in Jerusalem. The Palestine Exploration Fund, founded in 1865, began systematic surveys, mapping the land's ancient ruins and biblical sites. Railways connected Jaffa to Jerusalem, telegraph lines stretched across the desert, and steamships brought pilgrims and settlers from afar. It was during this same period that Jewish immigration, small at first, began to grow. Jewish communities had always existed in Palestine, concentrated in cities like Jerusalem, Zefat, Hebron, and Tiberias. But by the late 19th century, a new movement was stirring in Europe, Zionism. In response to waves of antisemitism and pogroms, Jewish intellectuals and activists in Europe began advocating for the re-establishment of a homeland in the ancestral land of Israel. Beginning in the 1880s, the first Aliyah, the first wave of Jewish immigration, brought settlers from Eastern Europe and Yemen. They established agricultural colonies such as Petah Tikva, Rishon LeZion, and Zikron Yaakov. These developments altered the social and political landscape of Palestine. While Jewish settlers purchased land legally, often from absentee landlords, their arrival displaced local tenant farmers, leading to rising tensions with Arab peasants. Palestinian Arabs, who formed the overwhelming majority, began to develop a sense of identity tied to both their land and their opposition to foreign domination, whether Ottoman or European. The last decades of Ottoman rule saw growing signs of strain. Nationalist movements spread across the empire, and local elites in Palestine debated questions of reform and self-rule. Newspapers emerged in Arabic, giving voice to new ideas of Arab unity and identity. The Young Turk Revolution of 1908 briefly revived hopes for constitutional reform, but it also intensified tensions between centralization and local autonomy. By the early 20th century, Palestine had become a land of contrasts: ancient villages beside modern schools, peasant farmers beside European missionaries, Ottoman administrators beside restless Arab intellectuals and Zionist pioneers. When World War I erupted in 1914, the fate of Palestine would again be decided by empires. The Ottoman Empire joined the Central Powers, aligning with Germany and Austria-Hungary. In response, the British saw strategic value in the lands between the Mediterranean and the Suez Canal, and soon, Palestine would become a bargaining chip in global politics, setting the stage for one of the most consequential chapters in its long history. When the First World War tore through the empires of the early 20th century, Palestine once again found itself at the center of global ambitions. The Ottoman Empire, aged and weakened, joined the side of Germany. Britain, determined to secure its lifeline to India through the Suez Canal, eyed the lands of Palestine as a strategic buffer. What followed was not only the collapse of an empire but the redrawing of an entire region, and the birth of a century-long conflict that would define Palestine's modern fate. In 1916, as the war raged, Britain and France secretly negotiated the Sykes-Picot Agreement, carving the Arab provinces of the Ottoman Empire into spheres of influence. According to this secret pact, Palestine was to be placed under international administration, a reflection of its religious and political sensitivity. Yet, even as that deal was struck behind closed doors, Britain was making conflicting promises to different sides. To the Arab world, Britain promised independence. Hussein bin Ali, the Sharif of Mecca, had launched the Arab revolt against Ottoman rule, encouraged by British officers like Thomas Edward Lawrence, the legendary Lawrence of Arabia. The Arabs believed their reward would be a vast independent kingdom stretching across the Levant, including Palestine. But to the Zionist movement, Britain offered something else entirely. In November 1917, British Foreign Secretary Arthur Balfour issued the Balfour Declaration, a short letter to Lord Rothschild expressing Britain's support for the establishment in Palestine of a national home for the Jewish people. It added that nothing should prejudice the civil and religious rights of existing non-Jewish communities. That single sentence, vague, contradictory, yet historic, would shape the destiny of Palestine for generations to come. When British forces under General Edmund Allenby marched into Jerusalem in December 1917, the Ottomans' 400-year rule came to an end. Allenby dismounted his horse before the Jaffa Gate, entering the city on foot out of respect for its sanctity. To many, it was the dawn of a new era. But for the people of Palestine, it was the beginning of a turbulent century of competing national dreams. After the war, the League of Nations granted Britain a mandate to govern Palestine, effectively making it a colony in all but name. The British mandate for Palestine, formalized in 1922, incorporated the Balfour Declaration into its text, obligating Britain to facilitate the establishment of a Jewish national home while safeguarding the rights of the existing population. Yet those two aims would prove irreconcilable. During the 1920s, Jewish immigration increased, funded by Zionist organizations and philanthropists. Settlers purchased land, built kibbutzim, and developed modern infrastructure. The city of Tel Aviv, founded in 1909 as a small Jewish suburb of Jaffa, grew rapidly into a thriving metropolis. Hebrew, once a language of scripture, was revived as a spoken national tongue. But alongside this remarkable cultural and economic revival came deepening tensions with the Arab majority. Palestinian Arabs, Muslim and Christian alike, protested that their homeland was being taken from them. They feared becoming strangers in their own land. The Palestine Arab Congress demanded independence and the suspension of Jewish immigration. Britain responded by balancing promises and compromises, issuing white papers to calm the situation, but none satisfied both communities. Violence soon erupted. In 1920, 1921, and 1929, riots and clashes broke out between Arabs and Jews. The 1929 disturbances, sparked in part by disputes over the Western Wall in Jerusalem, resulted in hundreds of deaths. These events hardened identities on both sides. By the early 1930s, two national movements had crystallized: Zionism, determined to build a Jewish state, and Palestinian nationalism, resolved to defend Arab sovereignty. As the Great Depression spread across the world, another storm gathered over Europe: the rise of Nazi Germany. The persecution of Jews intensified, and a new wave of refugees fled to Palestine. Between 1933 and 1939, over 250,000 Jewish immigrants arrived, the fifth Aliyah, transforming the demographics and fueling Arab resentment. In response, Palestinian leaders called for revolt. In 1936, the Great Arab Revolt erupted, beginning as a general strike and evolving into a full-scale uprising against British rule and Zionist immigration. For 3 years, rebels led by figures like Ad-Din al-Qassam and Abdul Qadi al-Husseini fought British troops and targeted colonial infrastructure. The rebellion was brutally suppressed. Thousands of Palestinians were killed, and much of their political leadership was exiled or executed. Yet the revolt left a lasting legacy. It marked the first organized expression of Palestinian national identity and resistance. Britain, exhausted by the violence, sought a solution. In 1937, the Peel Commission proposed partitioning Palestine into separate Jewish and Arab states, with Jerusalem under British control. It was the first official endorsement of dividing the land. The Zionist leadership accepted it as a basis for negotiation, but the Arabs rejected it outright, unwilling to cede their homeland. Partition was shelved, but the idea would resurface again and again. Then came the Second World War. Once more, the Middle East became a theater of global conflict. The Zionist movement largely supported the Allies, hoping loyalty would strengthen their post-war case for statehood. Many Palestinian Arabs, still resentful of British repression, remained wary. When the Holocaust was revealed in all its horror, 6 million Jews murdered across Europe, the world of sympathy for the Jewish people reached unprecedented levels. For many in the West, the creation of a Jewish homeland seemed both a moral necessity and historical justice. But for the Arabs of Palestine, it meant another catastrophe looming on the horizon. As the war ended in 1945, Britain was weary and bankrupt. Violence in Palestine escalated once again, now not only between Arabs and Jews, but also between Jewish paramilitary groups and the British themselves. Underground organizations like the Haganah, Irgun, and Lehi launched attacks on British installations, demanding independence. The British, caught between two irreconcilable peoples, decided to hand the problem over to the newly formed United Nations. In 1947, the UN proposed Resolution 181, the Partition Plan. It called for two states, one Jewish and one Arab, with Jerusalem as an international city. The plan awarded 55% of the land to the Jewish state, even though Jews made up only about 1/3 of the population at the time. Zionist leaders, though divided, accepted it. The Palestinian Arabs and the surrounding Arab states rejected it as unjust and illegitimate. To them, it was the final stage of a colonial process that had dispossessed the indigenous population. Tensions boiled over into open warfare. The civil conflict of 1947 to 48 tore through mixed towns and villages. Both sides committed atrocities, and entire communities were uprooted. When Britain finally withdrew its forces in May 1948, the last High Commissioner sailed from Haifa, leaving behind chaos. The very next day, David Ben-Gurion, leader of the Jewish Agency, declared the independence of the State of Israel. For Jews, it was a moment of triumph, the rebirth of a nation after 2,000 years of exile. For Palestinians, it was al-Nakba, the catastrophe, the beginning of exile, displacement, and statelessness. As Israel proclaimed statehood, 5 Arab armies, Egypt, Jordan, Syria, Lebanon, and Iraq, invaded. The Arab-Israeli War of 1948 was fierce and decisive. Despite being outnumbered at first, Israel's organized forces prevailed. By the time the armistice agreements were signed in 1949, Israel controlled 78% of historic Palestine, far more than the UN plan had allotted. Over 700,000 Palestinian Arabs fled or were expelled from their homes, becoming refugees in neighboring countries and in the remaining Palestinian territories, the West Bank, annexed by Jordan, and Gaza. administered by Egypt. Villages were entered, cities transformed, and maps redrawn. What had been Palestine under Ottoman and British rule was now divided into three parts: Israel, the West Bank, and the Gaza Strip. The refugees waited in camps, clutching keys to homes they could never return to. The conflict that began as a clash of promises and identities had now become a struggle for survival, one that would reverberate through every decade that followed. In the years following 1948, the map of the Middle East was irrevocably changed, but the question of Palestine was far from settled. For the hundreds of thousands of Palestinians who had fled their homes, life in refugee camps became the new reality. Families who once lived in the orange groves of Jaffa or the hills of Galilee now found themselves in tents on the outskirts of Amman, Damascus, Beirut, and Gaza. The world called them refugees. But they called themselves something else, a people awaiting return. Meanwhile, the newly established State of Israel set about consolidating its existence. Backed by international recognition and a flood of Jewish immigrants, Holocaust survivors, Jews from the Arab world, and later from Europe and beyond, Israel's population nearly doubled within a few years. Cities expanded, agriculture flourished, and a powerful sense of purpose bound its citizens together. Yet at its core lay the memory of struggle and survival, and a deep fear of annihilation, surrounded as it was by hostile Arab states. For the Arab world, the loss of Palestine was a wound to both pride and politics. Across the region, leaders and movements vowed to reverse the defeat. Egypt's charismatic new president, Gamal Abdel Nasser, emerged in the 1950s as the champion of Arab nationalism. Under his vision of pan-Arab unity, Palestine became not merely a local issue but a symbol of Arab dignity. From Cairo to Damascus, the cry was the same: Palestine will be liberated. In 1956, that call seemed to resonate with global significance. The Suez Crisis erupted when Nasser nationalized the Suez Canal, prompting Britain, France, and Israel to launch a joint invasion of Egypt. Israeli forces stormed into the Sinai Peninsula, swiftly defeating Egyptian troops. But under pressure from the United States and the Soviet Union, unlikely allies in this case, the invading powers were forced to withdraw. Nasser emerged as a hero, and his prestige soared. Across the Arab world, the dream of unity under Egyptian leadership grew stronger. But for the Palestinians themselves, still scattered and voiceless, little had changed. In the refugee camps of Lebanon and Gaza, a new generation was coming of age, a generation that had never seen their ancestral villages, but had inherited the stories, the keys, and the longing of their parents. They would no longer wait for Arab armies to redeem their homeland. They would take matters into their own hands. By the early 1960s, Palestinian students, exiles, and intellectuals began forming armed organizations dedicated to the liberation of Palestine. Among them was a young civil engineer named Yasser Arafat. Born in Cairo to Palestinian parents, Arafat co-founded Fatah, a movement that sought to fight Israel through guerrilla warfare. Its motto was simple: revolution until victory. Unlike the Arab states, Fatah operated independently, a movement by Palestinians for Palestinians. In 1964, under Arab League sponsorship, the Palestine Liberation Organization, PLO, was established. It was meant to coordinate Palestinian political and military efforts. At first, it was tightly controlled by the Arab governments, particularly Egypt. But within a few years, Fatah and Arafat would seize its leadership, transforming the PLO into the central voice of Palestinian nationalism. Then came 1967, the year that would redefine the entire Middle East. Tensions had been building for months. Border skirmishes between Israel and its neighbors intensified, and Nasser, emboldened by his popularity, ordered UN peacekeepers out of the Sinai and closed the Straits of Tiran to Israeli shipping. The region braced for war. On June 5, 1967, Israel launched a preemptive strike. In 6 astonishing days, the Israeli military achieved one of the most decisive victories in modern history. It destroyed the Egyptian, Syrian, and Jordanian air forces on the ground, captured the Sinai Peninsula from Egypt, the Golan Heights from Syria, and from Jordan, the West Bank and East Jerusalem. For the first time since antiquity, all of Jerusalem was under Jewish control. The euphoria in Israel was immense. To many Jews, the capture of Jerusalem, the Western Wall once again within reach, was nothing short of miraculous. But for Palestinians and Arabs, it was another catastrophe. More than 300,000 Palestinians were displaced once again, fleeing across the Jordan River. The remainder now lived under Israeli military occupation. The War of 1967 changed everything. It expanded Israel's borders threefold, redrew the geopolitics of the region, and turned the Palestinian question from a refugee issue into one of occupation and national resistance. The Arab world, humiliated once more, gathered at Khartoum and issued the famous 3 no's: no peace with Israel, no recognition, and no negotiations. For the Palestinians, however, something deeper was taking root: the realization that their liberation would not come from Arab armies, but from their own struggle. The PLO, now dominated by Arafat's Fatah faction, shifted its base of operations to Jordan and began launching guerrilla attacks across the border. The organization adopted a new charter, calling for the creation of a democratic, secular state in all of historic Palestine. Its fighters, the Fida'in, meaning those who sacrifice themselves, became symbols of defiance across the Arab world. As the 1970s dawned, Palestine was no longer a forgotten cause. It was a rallying cry, an identity, and a movement. Yet the road ahead would be paved with both triumph and tragedy. The aftermath of the 1967 war left the Arab world shaken and searching for redemption. Across the region, the idea of resistance, mukawama, gained renewed strength. For Palestinians, the humiliations of defeat gave way to a sense of self-reliance. The Palestine Liberation Organization, once a loose coalition under Arab oversight, now emerged as a fully independent force, not merely a political body, but a symbol of national identity. From bases in Jordan, the PLO launched cross-border raids into Israeli territory. To many Palestinians, these Fida'in operations were acts of heroic defiance, a people reclaiming their dignity through arms. But to Jordan's King Hussein, they were a growing threat. The PLO's popularity and its semi-autonomous presence in Jordan challenged his authority. The tension between the Palestinian guerrillas and the Jordanian state was like dry tinder waiting for a spark. That spark came in September 1970. After a series of hijackings and escalating clashes, the Jordanian army moved to expel the PLO. The fighting that followed was brutal. Known to history as Black September, the conflict saw thousands killed, mostly Palestinians, and the PLO driven from Jordan entirely. It was a tragic irony, a people without a homeland now expelled from the very country that had offered them refuge. The PLO leadership, led by Yasser Arafat, fled north to Lebanon, where they would establish a new base of operations. Lebanon, with its delicate mosaic of religious and political factions, soon became both a sanctuary and a battlefield. In the early 1970s, the PLO effectively created a state within a state in southern Lebanon. From there, it organized schools, hospitals, and militias. The refugee camps became centers of Palestinian life and resistance, while the surrounding Lebanese communities grew increasingly divided over the PLO's presence. Meanwhile, the broader Arab-Israeli conflict entered a new phase. The humiliation of 1967 still burned deeply across the Arab world, and no leader felt its sting more than Egypt's Gamal Abdel Nasser. But before he could seek redemption, Nasser died suddenly in September 1970, leaving his vice president, Anwar Sadat, to inherit both his mantle and his burden. Sadat faced enormous pressure. Egypt's pride demanded vengeance, and its people demanded dignity. In October 1973, during the Jewish holy day of Yom Kippur, Egypt and Syria launched a surprise attack on Israel. The Yom Kippur War, or October War, began with Egyptian forces crossing the Suez Canal and storming the supposedly impregnable Bar Lev line, while Syrian troops advanced on the Golan Heights. For the first time since 1948, the Arab armies achieved early success. The shock was profound. Israel, caught off guard, scrambled to respond. For a brief moment, it seemed as though the tide of history might turn. The Arab soldiers who crossed the canal fought not only for territory but for the memory of Palestine, for the dignity lost in 1948 and 1967. But Israel, backed by a massive US airlift of supplies, regrouped. Its forces counterattacked, crossing the canal in the opposite direction and encircling Egypt's Third Army. A ceasefire was declared under US and Soviet pressure. Though Israel emerged militarily superior once again, the war had changed the region's psychology. For Egypt, it was not a defeat but a partial victory, proof that the Arab world could challenge Israel on the battlefield. For Israel, it was a sobering reminder of vulnerability. And for the Palestinians, it was a lesson in geopolitical realism, that Arab armies would not bring liberation and that their own struggle must take center stage. In the aftermath, Yasser Arafat consolidated his leadership of the PLO. Under his guidance, the organization gained diplomatic recognition across the Arab world and beyond. The Fida'in became icons of resistance, their images plastered on walls from Cairo to Algiers, their stories celebrated in song and poetry. Yet the PLO's growing influence also drew new enemies. In Lebanon, sectarian tensions deepened as Palestinian fighters clashed with Christian militias, sowing the seeds of civil war. In 1975, Lebanon exploded into chaos. The Lebanese Civil War would rage for 15 years, engulfing the country in destruction. The PLO became one of the major actors in this conflict, aligned with leftist and Muslim factions against right-wing Christian forces. Israeli raids on southern Lebanon intensified as Israel sought to eliminate Palestinian bases. Villages were bombed, refugee camps were destroyed. For the people of Lebanon, and for Palestinians once again, the dream of liberation was eclipsed by the nightmare of endless war. Amid this turmoil, a seismic political shift was occurring in the Arab world. In 1977, Egyptian President Anwar Sadat stunned the region by traveling to Jerusalem, the first Arab leader to do so. There, he addressed the Israeli Knesset, declaring that peace was possible. 2 years later, in 1979, Egypt and Israel signed the Camp David Accords, brokered by US President Jimmy Carter. Egypt regained the Sinai Peninsula, but the price was high: diplomatic isolation from the Arab world and accusations of betrayal. For the first time, an Arab state had made peace with Israel, and Palestine was left out of the equation entirely. The Palestinian cause, once the heart of Arab nationalism, was now more fragmented than ever. Arab unity had splintered, the PLO was embroiled in Lebanon's chaos, and a new, uncertain era was beginning. Yet even amid this despair, the Palestinians clung to their identity, their memory, and their determination to return. By the dawn of the 1980s, the struggle would enter yet another chapter, one that would redefine both Palestinian politics and the global perception of their cause. The 1980s opened with the Middle East still reeling from war, revolution, and shifting alliances. For the Palestinians, the dream of liberation had survived every setback, but it was now trapped amid regional turmoil. In Lebanon, the PLO's state within a state had made it both powerful and vulnerable, admired by many Arabs, resented by others, and targeted relentlessly by Israel. In 1982, Israel launched a full-scale invasion of Lebanon. The stated goal was to stop Palestinian attacks on northern Israel, but the campaign quickly expanded. Under Defense Minister Ariel Sharon, Israeli forces pushed deep into Lebanese territory, besieging Beirut, where Yasser Arafat and the PLO leadership were headquartered. For weeks, Israeli warplanes bombarded the city, reducing entire neighborhoods to rubble. The world watched in horror as civilians suffered under the relentless assault. Eventually, under international mediation, a ceasefire was reached. The PLO agreed to evacuate Beirut, and its fighters were dispersed across the Arab world: Tunisia, Yemen, Sudan. Arafat himself left aboard a ship, waving to crowds who lined the shores, unsure whether they would ever see him return. But the war was not over. Shortly after the PLO's withdrawal, Lebanese Christian militias allied with Israel entered the Sabra and Shatila refugee camps. For 2 nights in September 1982, they massacred hundreds, possibly thousands, of Palestinian civilians. The Israeli army, which had surrounded the camps, did nothing to stop the killings. The massacre shocked the world and led to massive protests inside Israel itself, marking a moral reckoning for its society. For Palestinians, it was another chapter of agony. But even as their leadership went into exile, the spirit of resistance did not die. It would rise again, not from armed militias in foreign capitals, but from the streets and alleys of Palestine itself. In December 1987, in the Jabalia refugee camp in Gaza, an Israeli military truck collided with a car carrying Palestinian workers, killing several of them. The deaths ignited years of pent-up anger and despair. Crowds poured into the streets, chanting for freedom. Stone-throwing youths faced heavily armed Israeli soldiers. What began as a spontaneous protest spread like wildfire across the occupied territories. The First Intifada, or uprising, had begun. For 6 years, Palestinians in the West Bank and Gaza waged a mass civil resistance movement unlike anything before. Strikes, boycotts, and demonstrations shook the foundations of Israeli control. Women organized underground schools when classrooms were shut down. Merchants refused to pay taxes. Children hurled stones at tanks. The uprising was raw, desperate, and deeply human. It showed the world that Palestinians were not merely refugees or militants. They were a people demanding recognition and self-determination. Israel's response was harsh. Thousands were arrested, homes were demolished, and curfews imposed. The scenes of confrontation, captured by global media, transformed international opinion. The Palestinian struggle was no longer just a regional issue. It was now a moral and political question on the world stage. During the Intifada, a new Islamist movement also emerged from within Gaza's mosques, Hamas. Founded in 1987 as an offshoot of Egypt's Muslim Brotherhood, Hamas rejected both the secular nationalism of the PLO and any compromise with Israel. It called for armed resistance and the establishment of an Islamic state in all of Palestine. From the start, its rise added a new ideological dimension to the Palestinian struggle, one that would later divide its politics and complicate its path toward peace. Meanwhile, the PLO leadership, watching events unfold from exile in Tunisia, sought a diplomatic breakthrough. The Cold War was winding down, and global politics was shifting. The 1991 Gulf War, in which Iraq invaded Kuwait, realigned regional alliances, and left the Palestinian cause more isolated than ever, especially after Arafat's ill-fated support for Saddam Hussein. Yet the same war created new opportunities. With the United States now dominant in Middle Eastern diplomacy, Washington pushed for a peace process. That process began with the Madrid Conference of 1991, bringing Israelis, Palestinians, and neighboring Arab states to the negotiating table for the first time. Though progress was slow, the momentum continued. Secretly, away from the cameras and the headlines, Israeli and Palestinian representatives began meeting in Norway. The result of those clandestine talks would soon change the course of history. In 1993, Yasser Arafat and Israeli Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin signed the Oslo Accords, a historic agreement that established mutual recognition between Israel and the PLO. For the first time, Israel acknowledged the Palestinians as a legitimate people with political representation, and the PLO recognized Israel's right to exist in peace. The Accords created the Palestinian Authority, granting limited self-rule in parts of the West Bank and Gaza, and set out a 5-year timeline for final status negotiations. The moment was sealed in an image that would circle the globe. On the White House lawn, under the gaze of US President Bill Clinton, Arafat and Rabin shook hands. The crowd erupted in applause. After decades of war and exile, it seemed that peace, elusive, fragile, yet imaginable, was finally within reach. But beneath the symbolism lay deep mistrust. Many Palestinians saw the Oslo Accords as a necessary step toward independence. Others viewed them as a betrayal, a surrender of rights without guarantees. Israeli settlers, too, denounced the agreement, seeing it as a threat to their religious and national claims. Extremists on both sides prepared to sabotage the fragile peace. And so, while the world celebrated a handshake, the ground beneath it was already shifting. Oslo had opened a door, but whether it led to freedom or another illusion would soon become clear. The euphoria of Oslo did not last. The 1990s were a decade of cautious hope, marred by violence, mistrust, and political stagnation. In 1995, Israeli Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin was assassinated by a right-wing extremist opposed to the peace process. His death was a severe blow to both Israelis and Palestinians, demonstrating how fragile reconciliation could be when extremists rejected compromise. Despite subsequent agreements, the Oslo II Accords in 1995 expanded Palestinian self-rule. The peace process faltered. Settlements continued to expand in the West Bank, borders remained contested, and the final status issues of Jerusalem, refugees, and security were deferred indefinitely. Tensions simmered beneath the surface. Frustration grew among Palestinians as the promised statehood seemed ever more distant. Economic hardships in Gaza and the West Bank, combined with continued military occupation, sparked unrest. In September 2000, peace talks in Camp David between Palestinian Authority President Yasser Arafat and Israeli Prime Minister Ehud Barak collapsed over disputes regarding borders, refugees, and the status of Jerusalem. The failure was catastrophic. Within days, protests erupted, quickly escalating into full-scale violence, the Second Intifada. Unlike the First Intifada, the Second Intifada was marked by both urban warfare and suicide bombings. Israeli forces responded with military incursions, curfews, and targeted assassinations. Entire neighborhoods were sealed off, checkpoints multiplied, and life in Gaza and the West Bank became increasingly militarized. Thousands of Palestinians were killed or injured, and Israeli civilians also suffered attacks. International opinion was divided, and attempts at ceasefire frequently failed. The Second Intifada lasted for nearly 5 years, leaving a generation scarred by violence, displacement, and shattered hope. Amid the turmoil, Palestinian politics fractured further. Hamas emerged as a political and militant force, rejecting negotiations with Israel and gaining popular support in Gaza and parts of the West Bank. The secular PLO, dominated by Fatah, faced criticism for corruption and perceived failure to achieve statehood. In 2006, Hamas won parliamentary elections in Gaza, resulting in a violent split with Fatah. By 2007, the Palestinian territories were effectively divided. Hamas controlled Gaza, while the Palestinian Authority administered parts of the West Bank. This division complicated diplomacy and weakened Palestinian unity on the international stage. Meanwhile, Israel continued expanding settlements in the West Bank, citing security needs and historical claims. Checkpoints, the separation barrier, and strict movement restrictions created fragmented Palestinian enclaves. The Palestinian population faced restrictions on travel, limited access to resources, and economic hardship. Gaza, under Hamas, became increasingly isolated, subject to blockades and repeated military incursions. Each confrontation left cities in ruins and deepened despair, yet the Palestinian identity persisted, sustained by memory, community, and the longing for return. Despite the challenges, Palestinian culture and civic life remained vibrant. Universities, schools, cultural centers, and media outlets continued to thrive. Art, literature, and poetry reflected the pain and resilience of the people. International advocacy for Palestinian rights grew, including campaigns highlighting the plight of refugees and occupied territories. Palestinians kept their history alive, transmitting stories of villages lost in 1948, of resistance movements, and of daily life under occupation. At the same time, global diplomacy sought a solution. Initiatives such as the Roadmap for Peace in 2003 and subsequent negotiations attempted to broker a two-state solution, envisioning Israel and a Palestinian state living side by side. Yet key issues, Jerusalem, borders, refugees, security, and recognition, remained unresolved. Repeated cycles of violence, political deadlock, and mutual distrust underscored the complexities of this century-long struggle. Entering the 21st century, the Palestinian struggle took on new dimensions. International recognition of Palestinian statehood grew, including a 2012 upgrade to non-member observer state status at the United Nations. Yet on the ground, occupation, settlement expansion, and periodic conflicts in Gaza continued to impede tangible progress. Generations of Palestinians have now been born under occupation or in exile, carrying with them the memory of 1948, al-Nakba, and the hope for eventual return and self-determination. Palestine's history is not merely a chronicle of wars and politics. It is also a story of resilience and continuity. From ancient Canaanite cities to Ottoman villages, from Jerusalem's holy sites to refugee camps in Gaza and Lebanon, the land and its people have endured. Their culture, music, literature, cuisine, religious traditions, and communal bonds has survived centuries of conquest, exile, and upheaval. Each generation preserves the memory of the past while striving to shape a future where freedom, dignity, and justice might coexist with their neighbors. The story of Palestine remains unfinished. Its ancient hills, olive groves, and bustling cities are witnesses to human triumph and tragedy alike. Its people carry the weight of history, yet their identity, culture, and aspirations endure. Despite the challenges, their narrative continues to unfold, a testament to endurance in the face of adversity, and a reminder that history is not merely about the past, but also about the possibility of what is yet to come. If you enjoy true historical documentaries and legendary mysteries, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to Timeless Histories and Legends for more journeys into the past.